Hello everyone and welcome back to The Deep, your favorite channel for horror stories. I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Don't forget to check out the first pinned comment for more. Night Shift, Clinic of Shadows. Alex had just started his new job as the night shift security guard at an old, run-down clinic on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation for being eerie, but Alex was eager to prove himself. It was his first night on the job, and the clinic was quiet, almost too quiet. The corridors were dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional hum of the ventilation system. Alex made his rounds, checking the doors and windows as instructed. The clinic was empty, save for a few patients in the recovery ward, all of whom were sound asleep. The stillness was unnerving, but Alex told himself it was just nerves. After all, it was his first night on the job. He tried to shake off the unease that gnawed at him, convincing himself that he was just overthinking it. As the hours ticked by, the clinic grew colder. Alex noticed the chill in the air, a cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it didn't help. The temperature drop was odd, especially for a building with a functioning heating system. He made a mental note to mention it to maintenance, but for now, he had to focus on his duties. At around 2 a.m., the first strange occurrence happened. As Alex walked past the main hallway, he heard a loud bang echo through the clinic. He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The sound had come from one of the patient rooms, but when he rushed over to check, he found the door firmly closed, the room inside silent and undisturbed. Confused, he shook his head and continued his rounds, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors that had been locked earlier were now ajar, windows that had been closed were now wide open, and the lights in the corridors began to flicker more violently. Each time Alex went to investigate, he found nothing out of place. But the feeling of unease grew stronger, settling like a heavy weight on his chest. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the clinic seemed to take on a life of its own. The once calm and quiet atmosphere was now filled with an eerie tension that made the hairs on the back of Alex's neck stand up. He could feel it, something was watching him, something unseen but undeniably present. The feeling was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. Determined to keep his composure, Alex focused on his duties. He made his way to the security office, where he could monitor the clinic's surveillance cameras. The grainy footage showed empty hallways and vacant rooms, but as he scanned the screens, something caught his eye. In the corner of one of the corridors, a shadow flickered, just for a moment, before disappearing into thin air. Alex's heart raced as he rewound the footage, but the shadow was gone. He couldn't be sure if it was a trick of the light or something more sinister. He leaned back in his chair, trying to rationalize what he had seen, but the nagging feeling of dread refused to let go. He knew he had to check it out, even though every instinct told him to stay put. As he walked down the hallway, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Alex could feel his pulse quicken as he approached the spot where he had seen the shadow on the camera. There was nothing there, just an empty hallway, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the clinic, followed by the sound of footsteps running down the corridor. Alex spun around, his flashlight sweeping through the darkness, but he saw nothing. The sound had been so real, so close, but there was no one there. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he tried to make sense of what was happening. It was as if the clinic itself was alive, playing tricks on his mind. Just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye. In the reflection of a nearby window, he saw it, a dark, shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching him. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. Alex's blood ran cold as he realized that whatever this was, it wasn't human. Alex's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the shadowy figure in the reflection. The dark shape stood motionless, its presence oppressive and terrifying. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead, frozen in place by sheer terror. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Alex could feel its eyes boring into him, watching his every move. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex slowly turned around to face the hallway behind him. But when he looked, there was nothing there, just an empty corridor stretching out into the darkness. The figure had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. But the fear remained, gnawing at him, refusing to let go. He backed away slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The clinic felt different now, more sinister, as if the walls were closing in on him. The shadows seemed to shift and move, whispering secrets that he couldn't quite hear. He knew he had to get out of there, but the thought of leaving the safety of the security office filled him with dread. As he made his way back to the office, the strange occurrences continued to escalate. The doors in the clinic began to slam shut on their own, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The lights flickered more violently, plunging the corridors into darkness for long, terrifying moments. And all the while, Alex could feel that unseen presence following him, lurking just out of sight. Back in the security office, Alex frantically checked the surveillance cameras, hoping to find some explanation for what was happening. But the screens showed nothing but empty hallways and silent rooms. He rewound the footage again and again, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure, but it was as if it had never existed. But deep down, Alex knew that something was wrong with this place, something beyond his understanding. The clinic was haunted, not by ghosts, but by something darker, something malevolent. The feeling of dread grew stronger, settling over him like a thick fog. He realized with a sinking feeling that he was trapped, alone in a building that was alive with dark forces. The longer Alex stayed in the clinic, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and the once familiar surroundings became twisted and distorted. The clinic, once a place of healing, now felt like a prison, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had been blurred. As the clock ticked past 4 a.m., the clinic fell into an eerie silence. The lights stopped flickering, the doors ceased their relentless banging, and even the whispers seemed to fade away. But the silence was far from comforting. It was a silence filled with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alex sat in the security office, his nerves frayed and his mind racing. He knew he couldn't stay there, but the thought of venturing back into the clinic filled him with dread. The surveillance cameras showed nothing but empty hallways, but he could feel that presence, that unseen entity, lurking just beyond the range of the cameras. With a deep breath, Alex decided to confront whatever was haunting the clinic. He couldn't spend the rest of the night cowering in the office, waiting for something to happen. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the hallway, determined to face the entity head-on. As he made his way through the clinic, the silence pressed down on him, heavy and oppressive. The cold air bit at his skin, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. He could feel that presence again, stronger now, more palpable. It was as if the entity was drawing closer, feeding off his fear. Then, without warning, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging him into total darkness. Alex's heart raced as he fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, the beam barely cut through the thick blackness. The air around him grew colder, and he could feel something moving in the darkness, something watching him. A low, guttural growl echoed through the hallway, sending a chill down Alex's spine. The sound was inhuman, primal, and filled with malice. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw it, the entity that had been stalking him. It was a dark, twisted figure, its form shifting and writhing as if made of shadows. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Alex's blood ran cold as he realized that this entity, wasn't just haunting the clinic, it was hunting him. The sight of the entity left Alex paralyzed with fear. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to defy all logic and reason. The entity's twisted form loomed in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unholy light that pierced through the shadows. Alex could feel its hatred, its hunger, and he knew that it was coming for him. In a blind panic, Alex turned and ran, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he sprinted down the hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the clinic, mixing with the low, guttural growls of the entity as it pursued him. The clinic's once familiar corridors had become a nightmarish maze, each turn leading him deeper into the darkness. The lights overhead flickered on and off, casting disorienting shadows that seemed to move and shift on their own. Doors slammed shut as he passed, the sound reverberating through the building like gunshots. The cold air bit at his skin, and the feeling of dread weighed heavily on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Alex's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the clinic seemed to be conspiring against him. Every door he tried was locked, every corridor led him back to where he started. The entity was toying with him, driving him deeper into madness with each passing second. He could hear it now, its raspy breaths growing louder, closer, as it closed in on him. In his frantic state, Alex stumbled into a storage room, slamming the door behind him and pressing his back against it. He was trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he fumbled with the lock, trying to keep the entity out. The room was small, cramped, with shelves lined with old medical supplies and dusty equipment. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. The growling had stopped, the footsteps had ceased, and the clinic was once again silent. But the silence was far from comforting. It was the silence of a predator lying in wait, the calm before the storm. Alex knew that the entity was still out there, waiting for him to make a move. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and he could sense the entity's presence just beyond the door. He was trapped, with no way out and nowhere to run. The terror was overwhelming, suffocating, and Alex knew that he was running out of time. The storage room felt like a tomb, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. Alex knew that he couldn't stay hidden forever. The entity was out there, waiting for him, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed him. He had to make a stand, had to confront the darkness that had taken hold of the clinic. With a trembling hand, Alex reached for the only weapon he could find, a rusty metal pipe that had been left behind on one of the shelves. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He knew that if he was going to survive the night, he would have to face the entity head-on. Taking a deep breath, Alex unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. The lights were still flickering, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The air was colder than ever, and the feeling of dread was almost suffocating. But Alex pushed forward, his grip tight on the metal pipe as he made his way through the clinic. He could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, its malevolent energy filling the air. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe, as if they were alive, and the low growl of the entity echoed through the corridors, growing louder with each step Alex took. He knew he was close, that the final confrontation was imminent. As he rounded a corner, he saw it, the entity, standing in the middle of the hallway, its dark form shifting and writhing like a mass of living shadows. Its glowing eyes locked onto Alex, and it let out a guttural snarl, a sound filled with rage and hatred. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around him, pressing down on him like a vice. But Alex didn't back down. With a shout, he charged at the entity, swinging the metal pipe with all his strength. The pipe connected with the entity, but instead of passing through it like smoke, it struck something solid. The entity let out a piercing scream, its form convulsing and twisting as if in pain. The lights in the hallway flickered violently, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering glass and slamming doors. The entity lashed out, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around Alex, pulling him closer. But he fought back with everything he had, striking the entity again and again, each blow weakening it, driving it back. With a final, desperate swing, Alex struck the entity square in the chest. The entity let out a deafening wail, its form collapsing in on itself, the shadows dissipating like smoke in the wind. The cold air lifted, the lights stabilized, and the clinic fell into a deafening silence. Alex stood there, panting, his hands trembling as he watched the last remnants of the entity fade away. The feeling of dread was gone, the clinic no longer felt alive with dark forces. He had survived the night, but the experience had left him shaken to his core. As he made his way out of the clinic, the first rays of dawn breaking through the windows, he knew that he would never forget the horrors he had faced in the Clinic of Shadows. Hollywood's darkest secret. In the glitz and glamour of 1980s Hollywood, few stars shone as brightly as Richard Evans. He was the epitome of success, a beloved actor with a string of box office hits and a charming smile that captivated audiences worldwide. Richard was the kind of man who could do no wrong in the eyes of the public. His face was on every magazine cover, and his name was synonymous with talent and charisma. But behind the scenes, Richard was hiding a dark and terrifying secret, one that would shake Hollywood to its core. Richard's rise to fame had been meteoric. He came from a small town, with dreams of making it big in the movie industry. His early years were marked by struggle and rejection, but Richard was determined. His break came when he was cast in a major blockbuster that catapulted him to stardom. From there, his career skyrocketed, and he became one of the most sought-after actors in Hollywood. But fame and fortune weren't enough for Richard. There was a darkness inside him that fame couldn't satisfy. Unbeknownst to the public, Richard harbored a twisted desire, one that grew stronger with each passing year. The Hollywood parties, the red carpets, the adoring fans, none of it filled the void within him. Richard craved something more, something darker. It began with small acts of cruelty, things he could easily hide behind the mask of a charming public persona. But as his fame grew, so did his need to indulge his darker impulses. The first victim was a young actress, new to Hollywood and eager to make a name for herself. She met Richard at a party, dazzled by his fame and good looks. He lured her in with promises of roles in upcoming films, using his status to manipulate her. But what began as a flirtation quickly turned sinister. Richard's charm gave way to something far more menacing, and the young actress soon found herself trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The media reported her disappearance as just another tragic case of a young starlet unable to handle the pressures of Hollywood. But Richard knew the truth. He had carefully planned every detail, ensuring that no one would ever suspect him. The thrill of the kill, the power he felt in those moments, was like nothing he had ever experienced. And with that first taste, Richard knew he couldn't stop. The Hollywood star was now a serial killer, and no one had a clue. Richard's success as an actor provided the perfect cover for his crimes. He continued to charm audiences and win awards, all while indulging his dark desires behind closed doors. The more famous he became, the more untouchable he felt. After all, who would ever suspect that Hollywood's golden boy was hiding such a horrifying secret? The press fawned over him, his fans adored him, and his colleagues respected him. But beneath the surface, Richard was unraveling. The disappearances continued, always the same type of victim, young, aspiring actresses who were new to Hollywood and desperate for their big break. Richard would meet them at exclusive parties, using his fame to lure them in. He was careful, methodical, never leaving behind any evidence that could be traced back to him. To the outside world, these disappearances were tragic but not uncommon in a city where dreams often turned into nightmares. As the body count rose, so did the rumors. The media began to speculate about the string of missing actresses, but there was no concrete evidence to link the cases together. The LAPD was under immense pressure to solve the disappearances, but they were stumped. There were no leads, no witnesses, and no clues that pointed to a single suspect. Richard reveled in their frustration, confident that he had covered his tracks perfectly. Despite his meticulous planning, Richard couldn't shake the feeling of exhilaration that came with each kill. It was a high like no other, a rush of adrenaline that left him craving more. But with each victim, the risks grew greater. He knew he had to be careful, that one mistake could bring his entire world crashing down. But the thrill of the hunt was too intoxicating to resist, and Richard found himself taking bigger and bigger risks. Then came Emily Wright, a young actress with a bright future ahead of her. She was different from Richard's previous victims, savvy, cautious, and well-connected. Richard saw her as the ultimate challenge, the perfect prey. He used the same tactics that had worked so well in the past, charming her with promises of stardom. But Emily was not easily swayed, and Richard found himself drawn into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. Richard had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, both on and off the screen. He was used to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it. But Emily Wright was different. She was not like the other women Richard had lured into his trap. She was smart, cautious, and she had heard the rumors. Still, Richard was determined to make her his next victim. The challenge only fueled his desire. Their first encounter was at an exclusive Hollywood party, where Richard had gone specifically to find his next victim. Emily was stunning, with a natural charisma that drew people to her. Richard watched her from across the room, calculating his approach. He knew he had to be careful. Emily wasn't the type to be easily manipulated. But Richard was confident in his abilities. He had done this many times before, and he knew how to get inside people's heads. Richard made his move, charming Emily with his usual smooth talk and promises of introducing her to powerful people in the industry. Emily was flattered, but also wary. She had heard the whispers about the missing actresses, and something about Richard made her uneasy. But she couldn't deny the opportunity he presented. Despite her reservations, she agreed to meet him at his estate to discuss a potential role in an upcoming film. The night they met at Richard's mansion was one Emily would never forget. From the moment she stepped inside, she felt a sense of foreboding. The estate was beautiful, but it was also cold and empty, devoid of the warmth and life she had expected. Richard's demeanor had changed as well. Gone was the charming actor, replaced by someone far more sinister. Emily's instincts screamed at her to leave, but it was too late. Richard had planned everything meticulously, as he always did. But this time, something went wrong. Emily was not as easily subdued as his previous victims. She fought back with a ferocity that took Richard by surprise. In the struggle, she managed to cut him with a shard of glass, a deep wound that would leave a scar. It was the first time any of his victims had injured him, and it enraged him. But in his fury, Richard made a mistake. He underestimated Emily. The moment Emily realized she had injured Richard, she knew she had to escape. The sight of his blood, the rage in his eyes, it was a wake-up call. This wasn't just a bad situation, it was a fight for her life. She didn't think twice. She ran, adrenaline pumping through her veins as she bolted out of the room and down the long, dark corridors of Richard's mansion. The luxurious estate that had once seemed so inviting now felt like a prison, with every door and window a potential trap. Richard was close behind, his wound only fueling his anger. He had never let a victim get away before, and he wasn't about to start now. The chase was on, and the once silent mansion echoed with the sound of their footsteps. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she searched for an exit, any exit. The rooms blurred together in her panic, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She could hear Richard's voice, cold and menacing, calling out to her, taunting her. But Emily wasn't going to give up. She was determined to survive. She ran through the mansion, trying doors and windows, searching for a way out. She found herself in the basement, a dark, labyrinthine space filled with strange and terrifying objects, souvenirs from Richard's previous victims. The reality of the situation hit her hard, but she couldn't afford to panic. She had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of Richard. Finally, Emily spotted a small window high up on one of the basement walls. It was just big enough for her to squeeze through. She scrambled up, using shelves and boxes to reach the window. She could hear Richard getting closer, his footsteps growing louder, his voice more urgent. With one final burst of energy, Emily pushed herself through the window and out into the night. The cold air hit her like a shock, but she didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, away from the mansion, away from Richard. Emily managed to find help from a passerby, who called the police. The LAPD arrived quickly, and Emily was taken to safety. But her ordeal was far from over. She knew that Richard wouldn't give up easily. He was a powerful man with connections, and he would do everything in his power to silence her. But Emily was determined to bring him down. She had survived the night, and now she was ready to fight. Richard Evans had always been careful, always in control. But Emily's escape had shattered that control, and now his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The cut on his arm throbbed painfully, a constant reminder of his failure. He knew that Emily would go to the authorities, that she would tell them everything. And with the wound she had inflicted, the police would have his DNA. For the first time, Richard felt a pang of fear. Back at his mansion, Richard tried to cover his tracks, but it was too late. The police were already on their way, and the media was beginning to catch wind of the story. The LAPD arrived at the estate, and what they found shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The basement, filled with macabre trophies from Richard's victims, was like something out of a nightmare. The tapes, the photographs, the blood, it was all there, undeniable evidence of Richard's crimes. As the investigation unfolded, the world watched in horror as the true extent of Richard's actions came to light. The media descended on Hollywood, turning the once beloved actor into the most hated man in America. Richard's face was everywhere, his name synonymous with evil. The public was shocked, betrayed by the man they had once adored. The golden boy of Hollywood had been hiding a monstrous secret all along. But Richard wasn't ready to give up. He had always thrived in the spotlight, and he wasn't going to let it end like this. He used his connections, his charm, his money, anything he could to try to escape the inevitable. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the police had him dead to rights. The more he tried to wriggle out of it, the deeper he sank into the quicksand of his own making. Richard's arrest was a spectacle, the final act in a twisted drama that had captivated the nation. The LAPD took him into custody, and the world watched as the once great actor was led away in handcuffs, his head held high, his smile still in place. But behind that smile, Richard knew that his life was over. The walls had finally closed in, and there was no way out. The trial of Richard Evans was the event of the decade. The courtroom was packed with reporters, fans, and the families of his victims, all eager to see justice served. Richard, ever the actor, played his part well. He denied the charges, claimed innocence, and tried to sway the jury with his charm. But the evidence was damning, and as the trial went on, the facade began to crack. The tapes, the photographs, the testimonies, they all painted a picture of a man who had used his fame and power to commit unspeakable acts. As the details of Richard's crimes were laid bare, the public shock turned to outrage. How had he been able to get away with it for so long? How had no one seen the signs? The media dissected every aspect of his life, searching for clues, for answers. But the truth was simple: Richard had been a master manipulator, a man who had fooled everyone, from his fans to his closest friends. The fall of Richard Evans was as dramatic as his rise had been meteoric. In the end, the jury found Richard guilty on all counts. The judge, in a scathing speech, condemned Richard for his actions, calling him a monster in human form. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his once glamorous life reduced to a cell and a cot. The man who had once been adored by millions was now reviled, his name forever tainted by the horrors he had committed. As Richard sat in his prison cell, he couldn't help but reflect on the path that had led him here. He had been at the top of the world, a star in the eyes of the public. But his hunger for power, for control, had driven him to commit the ultimate sin. And now, he was paying the price. The fame, the fortune, the adulation, it had all been a mask, hiding the darkness that lurked within. In the years that followed, Hollywood moved on, but the shadow of Richard Evans lingered. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the brightest smiles. The victims he had claimed were remembered, their stories told and retold in documentaries and books. But for Richard, there would be no redemption, no comeback. He was a legend, but not the kind he had once aspired to be. Haunted by evil, the possession. Sarah and Michael had always dreamed of leaving the city behind and settling in a quiet, rural area. When they found an old, abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town, it seemed like the perfect place to start their new life. The house was weathered and worn, but it had a certain charm that spoke to them. They knew it would take a lot of work to make it livable, but they were excited about the challenge. The locals in the town were friendly enough, though a bit reserved when they learned where the couple was moving. Sarah and Michael noticed the way people would exchange uneasy glances whenever the farmhouse was mentioned. One elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, even went as far as to warn them. "That house has a history," she said, her voice trembling. "A dark history. Best to leave it be." But Sarah and Michael brushed off her warnings as nothing more than small-town superstition. The first few weeks in the farmhouse were peaceful. Sarah and Michael spent their days cleaning, repairing, and slowly bringing the house back to life. But as they dug deeper into the renovation, they began to uncover things that made them uneasy. There were strange symbols etched into the walls of the basement, symbols that neither of them recognized. The air in the house grew heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that neither of them could explain. Then, strange things started happening. It began with small incidents, objects moving on their own, doors closing by themselves, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. Sarah would sometimes hear faint whispers late at night, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Michael dismissed it as the house settling, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, while cleaning out the attic, Sarah found an old, dusty mirror hidden beneath a pile of forgotten furniture. The moment she uncovered it, a chill ran down her spine. The mirror was ornate, with a heavy, gilded frame covered in strange, intricate carvings. But it wasn't the mirror's appearance that unsettled her, it was the feeling of dread that washed over her the moment she looked into it. She quickly covered the mirror back up, deciding to deal with it later. But from that moment on, the atmosphere in the house changed, growing darker and more oppressive with each passing day. As the days went by, the strange occurrences in the farmhouse grew more frequent and more terrifying. The once cozy home that Sarah and Michael had envisioned was becoming a place of fear and unease. Sarah began to feel a constant presence in the house, as if someone, or something, was watching her every move. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a heavy, suffocating presence that made it hard for her to breathe. Michael, ever the skeptic, tried to reassure her. He attributed the strange happenings to the stress of the move and the amount of work they were doing on the house. But even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over them like a dark cloud. The farmhouse, once filled with the sound of laughter and hope, had fallen silent. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to grow darker and more menacing. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to relax, the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. Sarah shivered, pulling a blanket around her, but it did little to ward off the cold. The lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, without warning, the television turned on by itself, the screen flickering to life with static. Sarah and Michael stared at the screen in shock, their hearts pounding in their chests. The static on the television grew louder, filling the room with a deafening noise. Sarah tried to turn it off, but the remote wouldn't work. The volume continued to rise, the noise piercing through their ears like a scream. Then, amidst the static, they heard it, a voice, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. The voice was guttural, inhuman, and it spoke in a language neither of them understood. It was as if something was trying to communicate with them through the static. Terrified, Michael finally managed to unplug the television, plunging the room into darkness and silence. But the damage had already been done. Sarah was trembling, her mind racing with fear. She knew, deep down, that they were no longer alone in the house. Something had been awakened, something ancient and malevolent. The sense of dread that had been building over the past weeks was now suffocating, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. After the incident with the television, the atmosphere in the farmhouse became unbearable. The once welcoming home now felt like a prison, with every corner filled with an oppressive, unseen force. Sarah found herself growing more anxious and fearful with each passing day. The whispers that had once been faint were now louder, clearer, and they seemed to follow her wherever she went. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing down her neck, watching her every move. Michael, too, began to feel the effects of the dark presence. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams that left him waking up in a cold sweat. He would dream of shadowy figures standing at the foot of their bed, of voices calling out to him from the darkness. But when he woke up, the room would be empty, silent except for the sound of his own racing heart. The lack of sleep was taking its toll, leaving him irritable and on edge. One night, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, she noticed something strange in the mirror she had found in the attic. The reflection was distorted, the image twisted and warped as if the mirror itself was alive. Sarah stared at it, her heart pounding, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. As she watched, a shadowy figure appeared in the reflection, standing right behind her. But when she turned around, there was no one there. The mirror became a source of obsession for Sarah. She would find herself drawn to it, unable to resist the urge to look into it, even though she knew it terrified her. The shadowy figure would appear more frequently, its presence growing stronger each time. It would whisper to her, its voice low and sinister, filling her mind with dark thoughts. Sarah tried to tell Michael about it, but he brushed it off as stress and fatigue. He didn't understand the horror that was consuming her. Then, one night, everything changed. Sarah was alone in the house, Michael having gone into town for supplies. As she stood in front of the mirror, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The hand was icy, its grip tight and unyielding. Slowly, she turned her head to look into the mirror, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The shadowy figure was no longer just a reflection, it was standing right behind her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. And then, with a voice that seemed to come from within her own mind, it spoke, "You belong to me now." From that night on, Sarah was no longer the same. The entity that had been haunting the farmhouse had taken hold of her, its presence consuming her mind and soul. She became distant, withdrawn, her once warm and loving personality replaced by a cold, detached demeanor. Michael noticed the change immediately, but he was at a loss for what to do. He tried to reach out to her, but it was as if the woman he loved had been replaced by a stranger. Sarah's behavior grew more erratic with each passing day. She would speak in strange languages, her voice low and guttural, the words foreign and harsh. She would stare at the mirror for hours on end, her eyes vacant and hollow. The house itself seemed to respond to her, the lights flickering violently, doors slamming shut, and objects moving on their own. It was as if the entity was using Sarah to exert its influence over the entire farmhouse. Michael was desperate to help her, but he didn't know where to turn. He reached out to the local priest, Father O'Connor, hoping that he might have some answers. When the priest arrived at the farmhouse, he immediately sensed the darkness that had taken hold of the place. The air was thick with an evil presence, and Father O'Connor knew that what he was dealing with was far beyond his experience. As the priest began to pray, Sarah's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back in her head. The entity within her reacted violently to the holy words, lashing out with a force that sent Father O'Connor flying across the room. The priest knew that this was no ordinary possession, this was something far more powerful, something ancient and malevolent. He realized that he was in over his head, and that he would need more help to save Sarah. Michael, terrified and desperate, begged the priest to save his wife. Father O'Connor agreed to perform an exorcism, but he warned Michael that it would be a battle unlike any other. The entity had a strong hold on Sarah, and it would not let go easily. The priest spent the next few days preparing for the ritual, gathering holy water, blessed oils, and sacred relics. The tension in the house grew unbearable, the air crackling with dark energy as the entity within Sarah grew more agitated. The night of the exorcism arrived, and the atmosphere in the farmhouse was electric with tension. The house itself seemed to pulse with dark energy, the walls almost breathing as the entity within Sarah prepared to defend itself. Father O'Connor arrived with 2 other priests, all of them grim-faced and resolute. They knew the danger they were about to face, but they were determined to save Sarah from the grip of the malevolent force that had taken hold of her. Michael watched in fear as the priests prepared for the ritual. They set up a makeshift altar in the living room, placing candles, crucifixes, and holy relics around the room. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah was restrained in a chair, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a cold, unearthly light. The entity within her was fully aware of what was about to happen, and it was ready to fight. Father O'Connor began the exorcism, his his voice strong and unwavering as he recited the ancient prayers. The other priests joined in, their voices rising in unison as they called upon the power of God to drive out the evil spirit. At first, Sarah remained still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. But as the prayers grew louder, more insistent, the entity within her began to stir. Sarah's body convulsed violently, her eyes snapping open as she let out a guttural scream. The sound was inhuman, filled with rage and pain. The room shook as the entity lashed out, the walls reverberating with its fury. The priests continued to pray, their voices growing louder, more forceful, as they commanded the spirit to leave Sarah's body. The entity fought back with all its might, its presence filling the room with a palpable darkness. As the exorcism continued, the battle between the priests and the entity grew more intense. Sarah's body twisted and contorted in ways that seemed impossible, her voice a mix of screams, growls, and unearthly laughter. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. Finally, after what felt like hours, the entity began to weaken. The priests pressed on, their prayers relentless, driving the spirit back. Sarah's screams grew fainter, her body relaxing as the entity's hold on her weakened. With one final, desperate scream, the entity was forced out, leaving Sarah slumped in the chair, exhausted and barely conscious. The room fell silent, the dark presence lifting as the entity was banished from the farmhouse. The silence that followed the exorcism was almost deafening. The farmhouse, once filled with dark energy and malevolent forces, was now eerily quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the house for so long had lifted, leaving behind a strange sense of emptiness. The priests, exhausted but relieved, gathered their things and prepared to leave. Father O'Connor offered a final blessing on the house, hoping to prevent the entity from ever returning. Michael rushed to Sarah's side, his heart pounding with fear and relief. She was conscious but weak, her face pale and drawn. The light that had once filled her eyes was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. The entity may have been banished, but the experience had taken a toll on her. Michael knew that it would take time for her to recover, but he was determined to help her heal. The nightmare was over, but the scars it left behind would remain. Over the next few days, the farmhouse seemed to return to normal. The strange occurrences stopped, the oppressive feeling of dread lifted, and the house once again felt like a home. But Sarah was not the same. She was distant, withdrawn, and plagued by nightmares. The memories of the possession haunted her, filling her mind with dark thoughts and terrifying images. Michael tried to comfort her, but there was a part of her that he couldn't reach, a part that had been forever changed by the experience. As the weeks went by, Sarah began to slowly recover. The nightmares became less frequent, and she started to regain some of her old self. But there was always a lingering fear, a sense of unease that never fully went away. She couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was still out there, waiting, watching. The farmhouse, though no longer haunted, still held a darkness that she couldn't escape. Michael, too, was affected by the events that had transpired. He found himself questioning everything he had once believed, wondering how something so evil could exist. The experience had shaken him to his core, leaving him with a deep sense of fear and uncertainty. But he was determined to stay strong for Sarah, to help her move forward and put the past behind them. In time, the couple decided to leave the farmhouse and start fresh somewhere else. The memories of what had happened were too strong, too painful to ignore. They sold the house and moved to a new town, hoping to leave the darkness behind. But even as they began their new life, the shadow of the past lingered. The memory of the possession, the fear and horror they had experienced, would stay with them forever, a reminder that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding, forces that can change lives in ways we can't even begin to imagine. Haunted woods, the bunker escape. The night was still, and the sky clear as a group of 5 friends gathered around a crackling campfire deep in the heart of the forest. They had been planning this camping trip for months, excited for a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was the perfect setting for a night of ghost stories, and as the firelight danced across their faces, the group began sharing tales of the supernatural. Jake, the group's self-proclaimed skeptic, started with a story about a haunted house he had once visited as a kid. His tone was mocking, dismissing the idea of ghosts as nothing more than figments of overactive imaginations. But as the stories went on, the mood around the campfire shifted. Even Jake found himself glancing over his shoulder into the dark woods, the tall trees casting long, eerie shadows. The last story of the night came from Emily, the quietest of the group. She spoke of an old legend, one she had heard from her grandmother. It was about a cursed forest, where the spirits of those who had died tragically were said to roam, forever seeking vengeance on the living. The legend spoke of a group of campers who had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found, their souls forever trapped in the forest. As she finished her story, a cold breeze swept through the campsite, causing the fire to flicker and everyone to shiver. The group laughed nervously, brushing off the unease that had settled over them. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders. They decided to call it a night, retreating to their tents, each one trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. As the campfire's flames began to die down, the forest seemed to come alive, the trees creaking, the wind whispering through the leaves, and the darkness closing in around them. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Jake was the first to wake, the sound of rustling leaves and snapping twigs pulling him from his sleep. He sat up in his tent, listening intently, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was moving through the campsite. He unzipped his tent cautiously, peering out into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the dying embers of the campfire and the shadows of the trees. Jake shook his head, convincing himself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as he lay back down, he heard it again, this time accompanied by a low, almost inaudible whispering. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking, their voices carried on the wind. Jake's unease grew, but he told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him after all the ghost stories they had told earlier. The rest of the group was soon roused by the strange noises. Emily, her face pale, whispered that she had heard footsteps outside her tent, slow and deliberate, circling around it. Mark, the most practical of the group, dismissed it as nothing more than animals in the forest, but even he couldn't deny the eerie feeling that had settled over the campsite. The fire, which had been glowing faintly, suddenly went out, plunging them into complete darkness. Panic began to set in as they scrambled to relight the fire, but no matter how hard they tried, the flames wouldn't catch. The darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, and the whispers grew louder, filling the air with an unearthly sound. The group huddled together, their flashlights barely penetrating the blackness, as they realized they were not alone in the forest. In the distance, they saw it, a faint, glowing light moving through the trees, as if carried by unseen hands. It flickered and danced, drawing closer with each passing second. And then, without warning, the light vanished, leaving them in total darkness once more. The whispers ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more terrifying. The group knew then that something was very wrong, and that they needed to leave the forest, now. With their nerves on edge, the group quickly packed up their belongings, deciding to abandon the campsite and make their way back to their cars. But as they began to walk, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of darkness. No matter which direction they took, they found themselves back at the campsite, as if the forest was playing a cruel game with them. Panic set in as they realized they were walking in circles. Mark, who had been leading the group, stopped suddenly, his flashlight illuminating the same tree they had passed just moments before. It was as if the forest itself was alive, shifting and changing to keep them trapped. The once familiar paths had vanished, replaced by an endless maze of trees and shadows. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with a chilling, disembodied chorus. The group huddled together, their fear growing with each step they took. Emily clutched her flashlight tightly, her eyes wide with terror as she whispered that they were not alone. She could feel them, the spirits of the forest, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees, heavy and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was following them. The group spun around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they seemed to surround the group from all sides. The fear was palpable, a cold sweat breaking out on their skin as they realized they were being hunted. Desperate to escape, they began to run, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they stumbled through the forest. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps kept pace, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. The trees seemed to stretch and twist, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands to grab at them. The forest was alive with malevolent energy, and it was determined not to let them go. Exhausted and terrified, the group found themselves back at the campsite, as if the forest had brought them full circle. The fire pit, now cold and dead, was a stark reminder of the nightmarish events they had endured. But amidst the panic, Emily remembered something, an old legend her grandmother had told her, about a hidden bunker deep within the forest, a place of refuge from the spirits that roamed the woods. Clinging to the hope that the bunker might be real, and might offer a way out, the group set off in search of it. The forest seemed to resist their efforts, the trees growing thicker, the paths more treacherous. But Emily was determined, leading the way with a sense of urgency that kept them moving forward. The whispers had faded to a low murmur, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Hours passed, and the group's hope began to wane. They were cold, tired, and the weight of the night's horrors was beginning to take its toll. Just as they were about to give up, Mark spotted something in the distance, a dark shape, half buried beneath the tangled roots of an ancient tree. As they drew closer, they realized it was the entrance to the bunker, hidden away in the heart of the forest. The bunker was old and rusted, the door heavy and difficult to open. But when they finally managed to pry it open, they were greeted by a narrow set of stairs leading down into the earth. The air inside was cold and damp, filled with the scent of mold and decay. But it was also silent, and for the first time since the night had begun, they felt a glimmer of hope. One by one, they descended into the bunker, the darkness closing in around them. The door creaked shut behind them, and for a moment, they were enveloped in total blackness. Emily fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she clicked it on, illuminating the narrow corridor that stretched out before them. The walls were lined with old, decaying wood, and the air was thick with the sense of something ancient and forgotten. But as they ventured deeper into the bunker, the sense of safety they had felt began to wane. The walls seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with each step. And then, just as they thought they had found a way out, they heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor, heavy and deliberate. The spirits had found them, and the real terror was only just beginning. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as the group huddled together in the narrow corridor of the bunker. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the spirits of the forest were closing in on them. Emily's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and the cold air seemed to wrap around them like a shroud. The group knew they had to keep moving, but every step felt like a descent into darkness. The bunker, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a tomb. The footsteps continued to echo through the narrow passageways, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. The spirits were angry, and they were determined to exact their revenge on those who had trespassed in their forest. Suddenly, the walls of the bunker began to shake, the floor beneath them trembling as if something powerful and malevolent was awakening deep within the earth. The lights flickered wildly, and the air grew colder still, so cold that their breath came out in white puffs. The group's fear was palpable, their hearts pounding in their chests as they realized they were trapped, with no way out. Then, without warning, the whispers turned into screams, piercing, inhuman screams that echoed through the bunker, filling their minds with terror. The walls began to close in, the ceiling seeming to lower, as if the bunker itself was alive, trying to crush them. The footsteps were now deafening, a relentless march that grew louder with each passing second. Desperate, Emily led the group down a side passage, hoping to find an exit. But the deeper they went, the more the bunker twisted and turned, leading them in circles. The spirits were toying with them, playing a cruel game that had no end. the walls began to drip with a dark, sticky substance, and the air was filled with the stench of death. As they reached a dead end, the group realized with horror that they were trapped. The footsteps were right behind them now, and the walls were closing in, the bunker itself coming alive with a malevolent force. The spirits had them exactly where they wanted them, and there was no escape. The group huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, as the darkness closed in around them, and the spirits prepared to take their revenge. Just as all hope seemed lost, Emily's hand brushed against something cold and metallic in the darkness. She grabbed it, her heart racing, and realized it was the handle of a hidden door, almost invisible in the shadows. Without thinking, she pulled it open, revealing a narrow passageway that led deeper into the earth. It was their only chance, and they had no choice but to take it. The group squeezed through the narrow opening, the walls of the passageway pressing in on them from all sides. The air was damp and foul, but they pushed forward, driven by the primal instinct to survive. The footsteps behind them grew fainter, the whispers receding as they moved further away from the bunker. But the sense of dread lingered, a constant reminder that the spirits were still watching, still waiting. The passageway seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the earth like a maze. The group was exhausted, their bodies aching from the strain, but they couldn't stop. They could feel the weight of the spirits' anger pressing down on them, could hear the faint echoes of the screams that had haunted them in the bunker. The passage was their only hope, but it was also a trap, a labyrinth designed to test their endurance and will. Finally, after what felt like hours, they saw a faint light ahead. The passageway opened up into a small, dimly lit chamber, and at the far end, they could see a rusted metal ladder leading up to the surface. The light was weak, but it was a beacon of hope in the darkness, a promise of escape from the horrors they had endured. The group hurried toward it, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. But just as they reached the ladder, the passageway behind them collapsed with a deafening roar. The ground shook, the walls crumbling as the spirits made one final attempt to trap them. The group scrambled up the ladder, their hands slipping on the rusted rungs as the earth trembled beneath them. The light grew brighter, and they could see the night sky above, a stark contrast to the darkness that had consumed them. One by one, they emerged from the bunker, gasping for air as they collapsed on the forest floor. The night was still, the forest eerily silent, as if the spirits had retreated, satisfied with the terror they had inflicted. The group lay there for a long time, staring up at the stars, their minds reeling from the ordeal. They had survived, but the scars would remain, a constant reminder of the night they had spent in the haunted forest. And as they finally made their way back to their cars, they knew they would never speak of what had happened, not because they wanted to forget, but because they knew the forest would never let them. Night of the Wizard, Pajama Party. It was a chilly Friday night, and a group of 5 best friends had gathered for their much-anticipated pajama party. The living room was warm and cozy, filled with laughter, pillows, and snacks. The girls were sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through Instagram, giggling as they commented on the profiles of handsome guys. The night was young, and they were in high spirits, enjoying the carefree atmosphere that only comes with being surrounded by friends. As they scrolled through endless photos, they stumbled upon the profile of a guy who was, without a doubt, the most attractive man they had ever seen. His name was Caleb, and his profile was filled with pictures of him traveling, working out, and living a life that seemed too good to be true. The girls couldn't help but swoon over his perfect smile, chiseled jawline, and piercing blue eyes. They jokingly talked about how amazing it would be if a guy like him could just show up at their door. As if on cue, the doorbell rang, startling the girls out of their light-hearted conversation. They exchanged curious glances, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. It was late, and they weren't expecting anyone. With a mixture of excitement and unease, Emily, the host of the party, got up to answer the door. The other girls followed her, their curiosity piqued. When Emily opened the door, she couldn't believe her eyes. Standing on the doorstep was none other than Caleb, the very man they had just been admiring on Instagram. He looked even more handsome in person, his smile warm and inviting. The girls were speechless, their minds racing to make sense of what was happening. Caleb casually explained that he had been in the neighborhood and seeing their Instagram stories about the pajama party, decided to stop by and say hello. The girls were flattered and intrigued, but a small voice in the back of their minds questioned the coincidence. How had he known exactly where they were? And why would someone like him, a stranger, suddenly appear at their door? But the excitement of meeting someone so perfect drowned out their concerns, and they invited him in, eager to talk to the man who had just walked out of their dreams and into their living room. As Caleb stepped into the living room, the girls felt a mix of disbelief and excitement. They couldn't help but feel a little starstruck, and Caleb's charm only added to the allure. He was smooth, confident, and effortlessly cool, engaging them in conversation as if they had known each other for years. The girls found themselves hanging on his every word, captivated by his presence. Caleb joined them on the couch, his demeanor relaxed and friendly. He asked about their lives, their interests, and what had brought them together for the pajama party. The girls eagerly shared details about their friendship, their love for fun nights in, and how they often spent time together laughing and enjoying each other's company. Caleb seemed genuinely interested, his gaze intense yet comforting, as if he understood them on a deeper level. Despite the ease of the conversation, there was something about Caleb that felt off. Emily, the most perceptive of the group, began to notice small, subtle details that didn't quite add up. His eyes, though mesmerizing, seemed to flicker with a strange light, and his smile, while perfect, didn't quite reach his eyes. There was an air of mystery about him, a sense that he was holding back something important. As the night wore on, Caleb's presence began to feel almost too perfect. The girls were having fun, but there was an underlying tension in the room that they couldn't quite shake. It was as if Caleb was weaving a spell around them, drawing them in with his charm while hiding something much darker beneath the surface. Emily's unease grew, but she didn't want to spoil the night for her friends. She kept her concerns to herself, hoping that her instincts were wrong. After an hour or so, Caleb stood up, saying he didn't want to intrude on their girls' night any longer. The girls were disappointed but thanked him for stopping by, feeling a strange sense of loss as he made his way to the door. Caleb turned to them one last time, his eyes lingering on each of them in turn, before flashing that perfect smile. "I'll see you all around," he said with a wink, and then he was gone, leaving the girls in a mixture of awe and confusion. With Caleb gone, the girls tried to return to their previous lighthearted mood, but the atmosphere had changed. The excitement of his visit was quickly replaced by an unsettling feeling that none of them could quite shake. They laughed it off, attributing it to the surreal nature of the evening, but deep down, each of them felt a growing sense of unease. As they settled back onto the couch, the lights in the living room began to flicker. It was subtle at first, just a slight dimming, but then it became more pronounced, as if the electricity was struggling to stay on. The girls exchanged nervous glances, trying to laugh it off as a coincidence, but the sense of dread in the room only grew stronger. Emily suggested checking the circuit breaker, but no one was eager to leave the relative safety of the living room. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, a chill so intense that it sent shivers down their spines. They huddled together, wrapping themselves in blankets, but the cold seemed to seep into their bones. The once cozy living room now felt like a cold, unwelcoming place, and the shadows cast by the flickering lights seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The girls tried to ignore it, to convince themselves it was all in their heads, but the fear was impossible to ignore. As they sat there, trying to distract themselves with more Instagram scrolling, they noticed something strange on their phones. Caleb's profile, the one they had been admiring earlier, had changed. The pictures were still there, but they were different, darker, more sinister. The once bright and cheerful images were now distorted, the colors muted, and the smiles twisted into something malevolent. It was as if the person they had met was not the same person in the photos, or worse, that the photos had been altered to reflect the darkness they were now feeling. Panic set in as the girls tried to make sense of what was happening. They checked each other's phones, only to find that the same changes had occurred across all their devices. It was as if Caleb's presence had left a mark, a dark stain that was spreading through their night. They were on edge, their nerves frayed, and that's when they heard it, a soft, rhythmic knocking at the front door. The same door Caleb had left through not long ago. The The knocking at the door sent a jolt of fear through the group. It was soft, almost polite, but in the context of the night, it felt like a death knell. The girls stared at each other, wide-eyed, their hearts pounding in their chests. No one wanted to open the door, but the knocking continued, relentless and insistent, as if whatever was on the other side knew they were inside, and it wasn't going to leave until they answered. Emily, summoning all her courage, decided to confront whatever was outside. She approached the door cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. The other girls stood behind her, holding their breath, their fear palpable. With a deep breath, Emily opened the door, half expecting to see Caleb standing there with that unnerving smile. But the doorstep was empty, the street beyond shrouded in darkness. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, but the knocking had stopped. Relieved but still on edge, Emily closed the door and locked it, double-checking to make sure it was secure. The group returned to the living room, trying to shake off the terror that had gripped them. But as they settled back down, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The only source of light was the faint glow of their phones, which now seemed to flicker and glitch, displaying distorted images of Caleb's face, his once perfect smile now a twisted, sinister grin. The girls huddled together, their fear mounting with each passing second. They tried to turn their phones off, but they wouldn't respond, as if they were being controlled by some outside force. The cold in the room grew more intense, the air thick with a sense of malevolence. And then they heard it, a low, whispering voice, echoing through the darkness, growing louder and more insistent. It was Caleb's voice, but it was distorted, as if spoken through a broken speaker. "You invited me in," it said, "and now you're mine." Panic set in as the voice grew louder, more threatening. The girls screamed, searching for a way out, but the darkness seemed to close in on them, trapping them in the room. The shadows on the walls began to move, taking on twisted, grotesque shapes that reached out for them. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, rhythmic energy, as if the house itself was alive. Just when it seemed like the darkness would consume them, the front door burst open with a deafening crash, revealing Caleb standing in the doorway. But he was different now, his perfect appearance twisted into something monstrous. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his smile was no longer warm, it was cold, cruel, filled with a hunger that sent shivers down their spines. Caleb stepped into the room, his presence overwhelming, and the girls realized with horror that they had invited something truly evil into their lives. Caleb's transformation from a charming stranger into a terrifying force of evil was complete. The girls watched in horror as he approached them, his once handsome face now a mask of cruelty and malice. The air around him crackled with dark energy, and the room seemed to warp and twist in response to his presence. It was as if the very fabric of reality was bending to his will, and the girls were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Caleb raised his hand, and with a flick of his wrist, the furniture in the room was flung aside, leaving the girls huddled together in the center of the floor. His eyes glowed with a sickly green light as he began to chant in a language none of them could understand. The walls pulsed with dark energy, the shadows growing thicker and more oppressive, and the room was filled with the sound of distant screams, as if the very house was crying out in pain. The girls tried to move, to run, but they found themselves frozen in place, their bodies held captive by some unseen force. Caleb's chant grew louder, more insistent, and the air was filled with the stench of burning incense and sulfur. The shadows around them began to take shape, forming twisted, demonic figures that moved closer with each passing second. The girls' terror was palpable, their hearts racing as they realized that they were the center of some dark, ancient ritual. Emily, who had always been the strongest of the group, fought with all her might against the force holding her down. She could feel Caleb's power pressing down on her, suffocating her, but she refused to give in. She knew that if they didn't find a way to break free, they would be consumed by the darkness, lost to whatever twisted fate Caleb had in store for them. Her mind raced as she searched for a way to stop him, but the darkness was overwhelming, her thoughts clouded by fear. Just as it seemed like all hope was lost, Emily's hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a small silver locket that had fallen from one of the shelves. She remembered the stories her grandmother had told her about silver's power to ward off evil, and she clung to it like a lifeline. With a surge of determination, she managed to lift the locket, pointing it toward Caleb. The moment the silver caught the light, Caleb recoiled, his chant faltering as he hissed in pain. The dark energy in the room wavered, and Emily knew she had found his weakness. Emily's heart raced as she realized she had found a way to fight back. The silver locket glowed faintly in the dim light, its presence disrupting the dark energy that Caleb had unleashed. The demonic figures that had been closing in on the girls seemed to falter, their forms flickering and wavering as if they were losing their grip on reality. Caleb, too, was affected, his once confident demeanor now tinged with fear and anger. With a burst of strength, Emily broke free from the invisible force that had been holding her down. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. The other girls watched in stunned silence, their fear momentarily giving way to hope as they saw Caleb's power weakening. Emily knew she had to act quickly. If she didn't stop Caleb now, they would all be doomed. Caleb, sensing his control slipping, lunged at Emily with a snarl, his once handsome face twisted into a mask of fury. But Emily was ready. She thrust the silver locket toward him, and as it made contact with his skin, a blinding light erupted from the locket, filling the room with a brilliant, purifying glow. Caleb let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing as the light seared through him, burning away the darkness that had consumed him. The shadows in the room recoiled, the demonic figures dissipating into nothingness as the light grew brighter and stronger. The house itself seemed to tremble, the walls shaking as if in the throes of some great, unseen battle. Emily pressed forward, driving Caleb back with the power of the locket, her determination unwavering. She knew she had to end this, to banish the evil that had invaded their lives once and for all. With one final, desperate effort, Emily pushed Caleb toward the door, the light from the locket growing so intense that it seemed to consume him entirely. Caleb's screams echoed through the house, a chilling reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of him. And then, with a deafening roar, he was gone, the light swallowing him whole and leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The room was still, the air clear and calm once more. The darkness that had threatened to destroy them was gone, banished by the power of the silver locket. Emily collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The other girls rushed to her side, tears streaming down their faces as they realized they had survived the nightmare. They had lost so much, but they had also gained a newfound strength, a bond forged in the fires of terror. As they helped Emily to her feet, the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. The house, once filled with darkness, now felt safe and welcoming again. But the memory of that night would never leave them, a reminder of the evil they had faced, and the strength it had taken to overcome it. Siren's Lure, Ocean's Terror. The luxury cruise ship Ocean's Dream was the epitome of opulence and relaxation, a floating paradise where passengers could leave their worries behind and enjoy the endless blue horizon. The ship had set sail from Miami, bound for a 2-week journey through the Caribbean, with stops at some of the most beautiful islands in the world. The passengers were a mix of families, honeymooners, and retirees, all eager to soak up the sun and indulge in the ship's many amenities. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The weather was warm, the seas were calm, and the mood on board was one of carefree enjoyment. Passengers lounged by the pool, sipped cocktails on the deck, and danced the nights away at the ship's various bars and clubs. But as the ship ventured further from land, deeper into the open ocean, a strange unease began to settle over the passengers. It started with small things, whispers among the crew, nervous glances between staff members, and the occasional passenger complaining of a strange feeling of being watched. But then, one evening, a passenger went missing. A young woman named Claire, who had been seen enjoying a drink at the bar just hours earlier, was nowhere to be found. Her friends reported her absence to the ship's security, but after a thorough search of the ship, she was declared missing at sea. The disappearance cast a shadow over the once carefree atmosphere of the cruise. The passengers were shaken, and rumors began to spread like wildfire. Some whispered that Claire had fallen overboard, while others speculated that she had been the victim of foul play. The ship's captain tried to calm the passengers, reassuring them that it was likely an unfortunate accident. But the sense of unease only grew as more passengers began to disappear, one by one, without a trace. As the days passed, the disappearances became more frequent, and the mood on the ship turned from one of concern to outright fear. The once lively pool decks were now deserted, the bars empty, as passengers locked themselves in their cabins, too afraid to venture out. The crew, too, seemed on edge, their once friendly demeanor replaced by a grim determination to maintain order. But no one could explain where the missing passengers had gone, or why they had vanished without a sound. With each passing day, the situation aboard the Ocean's Dream grew more dire. The ship, once filled with laughter and music, was now eerily quiet, the once lively atmosphere replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. Passengers avoided each other's eyes, their faces pale and drawn with fear. The disappearances continued, and it seemed as though no one was safe. It didn't matter where they were on the ship or who they were with, anyone could vanish at any moment. The captain and crew were at a loss. They had searched every inch of the ship, from the luxurious suites to the engine room, but there was no sign of the missing passengers. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious, and there was no evidence to suggest that the disappearances were anything other than accidents. But the number of missing passengers was growing too large to ignore, and the crew knew they had to find answers before panic consumed the entire ship. Among the crew was a seasoned sailor named Tom, a man who had spent most of his life at sea. He was respected by his fellow crew members for his experience and level-headedness, but even Tom couldn't explain what was happening on board. He had seen strange things at sea before, but nothing like this. The disappearances were too frequent, too inexplicable, and they were happening in plain sight, with no warning and no trace left behind. As the days went on, Tom began to notice something strange, whispers, barely audible, drifting through the corridors of the ship. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a soft, melodic sound that was almost impossible to ignore. At first, he thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the ship's hull, but the whispers grew louder and more insistent, especially at night when the ship was at its quietest. Curious and unnerved, Tom decided to investigate. He spent his nights wandering the ship, listening for the whispers and trying to trace their source. But the more he listened, the more disoriented he became. The whispers seemed to come from the sea itself, carried on the wind and through the waves, calling out to him in a language he couldn't understand. They were both beautiful and terrifying, a haunting melody that made his skin crawl. Tom knew he was close to finding the truth, but he was also terrified of what he might discover. As Tom delved deeper into the mystery, the whispers began to take on a more sinister tone. They were no longer just soft melodies drifting through the air, they became a song, a siren's call that beckoned to him, pulling at the edges of his mind. He found it increasingly difficult to resist, the haunting tune filling his thoughts and making it hard to concentrate on anything else. It was as if the song was alive, worming its way into his very soul. The other crew members noticed the change in Tom. He had always been calm and composed, but now he seemed distracted, almost dazed. His once clear eyes were clouded with something they couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or something darker. They tried to talk to him, to snap him out of it, but Tom brushed off their concerns, insisting he was fine. But deep down, he knew he was anything but fine. The song was getting stronger, more insistent, and he was finding it harder and harder to resist its pull. One night, as the ship sailed through calm, moonlit waters, Tom found himself drawn to the edge of the deck. The song was louder now, almost deafening, and he felt an overwhelming urge to follow it, to dive into the dark waters below. He gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to leap overboard. The sea below seemed to beckon to him, the waves shimmering in the moonlight, and the song grew even more beautiful, promising something he couldn't quite understand but desperately craved. Just as he was about to give in, a strong hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back from the edge. It was one of the younger crew members, a man named Miguel, who had noticed Tom's strange behavior and followed him onto the deck. "What are you doing?" Miguel demanded, his voice filled with concern. "You almost went overboard." Tom shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He muttered something about hearing a song, but Miguel looked at him like he was crazy. He hadn't heard anything. Realizing how close he had come to losing himself, Tom finally confided in Miguel about the whispers, the song, and his suspicions that something otherworldly was at play. Miguel listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each word. He hadn't heard the song himself, but he had noticed strange things happening on board, the way the sea seemed to change around them, the strange lights in the water at night. Together, they decided to dig deeper into the mystery, knowing that the answer to the disappearances lay somewhere in the dark waters below. With Miguel's help, Tom began to investigate the ship more thoroughly. They spent their nights combing through the ship's logs, searching for any clues that might explain the disappearances. They questioned the other crew members, piecing together stories and strange experiences that had been dismissed or forgotten. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear that the disappearances were not accidents or coincidences. Something was deliberately luring the passengers away. Tom and Miguel focused their attention on the areas of the ship closest to the water, the lower decks, the engine room, and the outer corridors that ran along the ship's hull. It was in these places that the song was strongest, almost as if it was trying to draw them closer to the sea. They noticed that the passengers who had disappeared had last been seen near these areas, often late at night, just before vanishing without a trace. One night, as they were searching the engine room, Tom and Miguel made a chilling discovery. Hidden in a small, forgotten compartment near the waterline, they found a collection of objects, personal belongings that had once belonged to the missing passengers. There were watches, rings, wallets, and even a few photographs, all arranged in a neat, almost ritualistic pattern. The sight sent shivers down their spines, and they realized that whatever was taking the passengers was not just killing them, it was collecting them. The realization hit them hard. There was something in the water, something ancient and malevolent, that was luring the passengers to their doom. Tom's mind raced as he remembered the legends of the sea, stories of sirens and mermaids who lured sailors to their deaths with their enchanting songs. He had always dismissed them as myths, but now he wasn't so sure. The song he had heard, the one that had nearly driven him overboard, was too real, too powerful to be just his imagination. Determined to find the source of the song, Tom and Miguel set up a watch on the lower decks, staying awake through the night as the ship sailed deeper into the open ocean. The song was growing stronger with each passing night, and they knew that if they didn't act soon, more passengers would disappear. They had to find the creature responsible and stop it before it was too late. The night was darker than usual, the sky overcast and the sea eerily calm as Tom and Miguel stood watch on the lower deck. The song had returned, more powerful and seductive than ever before. It drifted through the corridors, wrapping itself around the ship like a fog, seeping into every corner and crevice. The few passengers who were still brave enough to venture out at night seemed to be in a trance, their eyes glazed over as they wandered toward the edges of the ship. Tom could feel the pull of the song deep in his bones, a temptation that was almost impossible to resist. It was beautiful, haunting, and filled with promises of peace and joy. But beneath the surface, he could sense the darkness, the malevolence that lay at the heart of the melody. He knew that if he gave in, he would be lost forever, just like the others. He had to stay strong, had to fight the urge to follow the song into the depths of the sea. As the night wore on, the song grew louder, almost as if the creature responsible knew that its prey was within reach. Tom and Miguel moved cautiously through the lower decks, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The ship seemed to groan under the weight of the song, the metal hull vibrating with each note. They were getting closer, they could feel it, but they also knew that they were running out of time. Suddenly, Tom spotted something in the water below. It was faint at first, just a shadow moving beneath the surface, but as they leaned over the railing, they could see it more clearly, a figure, half submerged in the water, its long hair floating like seaweed around its face. The creature's eyes were glowing with an otherworldly light, and its mouth was open, singing the song that had lured so many to their doom. It was a siren, a creature of legend, and it was real. The sight of the siren filled Tom with both terror and awe. It was beautiful in a way that defied description, but there was something monstrous about it, something that made his blood run cold. The creature's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, he felt himself slipping, the urge to dive into the water overwhelming. But Miguel's voice snapped him out of it, reminding him of what was at stake. They had to stop the siren before it claimed more lives. Miguel had come prepared, and he quickly pulled out a flare gun from his bag. With a steady hand, he aimed it at the siren and fired. The flare shot through the air, illuminating the night with a brilliant red light. The siren let out a piercing shriek, the song breaking off as it disappeared beneath the waves. The spell was broken, and the passengers who had been drawn to the edges of the ship seemed to wake from their trances, confused and terrified. With the siren momentarily driven away, Tom and Miguel knew they had little time to act. The creature would not give up so easily. It would return, and when it did, it would be even more dangerous. The passengers were shaken but safe for now, though the tension on board was palpable. Tom and Miguel gathered the remaining crew, explaining what they had discovered and formulating a plan to deal with the siren once and for all. The crew was skeptical at first, struggling to believe that a mythical creature could be responsible for the disappearances. But the evidence was undeniable: the belongings of the missing passengers, the strange lights in the water, and the haunting song that had nearly driven Tom to his death. With no other explanation in sight, the crew reluctantly agreed to help. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, flares, harpoons, and even makeshift weapons, and prepared for the final confrontation. As the ship sailed deeper into the night, the tension grew. The sea was calm, too calm, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The crew stood watch on the deck, their eyes scanning the dark waters below, waiting for the siren to reappear. They knew that this would be a fight for their lives, and that the creature would not go down without a battle. Hours passed, and just when it seemed like the siren might not return, the song began again. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it quickly grew in strength, filling the air with its haunting melody. The crew braced themselves as the siren's figure emerged from the water, her glowing eyes fixated on the ship. This time, there was no doubt, she was coming for them, and she would not be stopped. The siren swam closer, her song growing louder, more insistent. The crew fired their flares, the bright lights illuminating the night, but the siren was undeterred. She reached the side of the ship, her hands clawing at the hull as she began to climb aboard. The crew fought valiantly, but the siren was powerful, her strength fueled by centuries of feeding on the souls of sailors. One by one, she picked off the crew members, dragging them into the water with her. In the chaos, Tom found himself face to face with the siren. Her beauty was both mesmerizing and terrifying, but he could see the darkness in her eyes, the hunger that drove her. With no other options left, he grabbed the flare gun and aimed it directly at her heart. The siren let out a final, deafening scream as the flare struck her, the light consuming her as she dissolved into the sea, her song dying on the wind. The silence that followed was overwhelming. The ship, battered and bruised, floated aimlessly in the water, the remaining crew and passengers too stunned to speak. They had survived, but the cost had been high. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Tom knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced on that fateful night. The siren was gone, but the memory of her song would haunt them forever. If you enjoy these kinds of spine-chilling stories, then I promise you won't want to miss the latest video I just posted on the channel. Trust me, it'll make you tremble with fear. Head over and check it out, if you dare. And before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm truly grateful that you stayed with me until the end, and if you have your own terrifying tale, feel free to send it to me at the email provided. Who knows? It might just be the next story featured here on the channel. Thanks again for watching, and as always, sweet dreams.